All right, good morning, everyone. It is now 10 o'clock, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right, so basically, if you are dropped from this session or if I disappear for more than 5 minutes, we probably won't be able to get back. Hopefully, we'll have a successful run this morning. Okay, so what we want to start off talking about is first, why we're doing these particular sessions. So what it comes down to is the purpose of these meetings is to review key information that we've covered this week and provide you guys, the students, an opportunity for live questions. So what we'll be doing today is we'll be doing what we're doing now this week, sort of a summary and overview. It's going to be sort of a summary, I guess, to an extent for those of you who've already seen the video lectures for this week. And then there'll be question and answer, a formal question and answer or comment section. But at any time, if you want some clarity on something or a key idea or just have a comment about something, just make yourself known and we can hopefully address that. Before I get started, I'm going to pause here for a second to see if there are any questions that you guys currently have or any clarifications that you need. So I'll wait for about 30 seconds or so. If you do have a question, you can unmute and ask the question or send it through chat if you want. All right, it sounds like most of us are okay. And also, before we leave today, too, I want to get sort of a roster of who's online with me, who's come to this session. You guys will receive some additional points for attending these particular types of sessions, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and continue then. So we have sort of set the stage for why we're doing these particular sessions. So, and I'm hoping that everyone can see the presentation. If you can't see the presentation, please let me know. I want to also provide us an opportunity to remind ourselves the course flow, how this course in 210 is working this semester. So each unit has sort of a table on your Canvas site, and you'll see there's going to be chapters and or materials that you're supposed to be responsible for, as well as various activities and assignments like reading the textbook chapters, completing the chapter quiz homeworks, reviewing and annotating the lecture notes, which are the slides for the presentations that I normally provide you, viewing the video lectures, and when possible, when I set it up this way, complete the video lectures with discussion questions. I just added that to the course. And then, of course, there are going to be other videos that I make available to you, like from Crash Course Psychology, for you to view as well as some standalone discussion forums, which I listed already in your course syllabus. I will always try to have a review session just prior to a unit exam. And of course, once that's done too, you'll complete the unit test. And so that's going to be the standard process that we'll have for our course this semester. I want to make sure that you are familiar with that so it doesn't come to a shock to you that you should know what the process is by now. All right, so that's where we are when it comes to the regular course flow. So let's talk about what we've gone over or started our discussion with and what you've been reading this week. We've been talking about developing across the lifespan, which is also developmental psychology. And so what I'll do now is spend the next few slides, 4 or 5 slides, to review some of the key ideas and concepts for this particular week, looking at chapter 4. First, we started our discussion with looking at major issues in psychology. Major issues in developmental psychology. And these issues fall into the categories of nature versus nurture, which I'm sure you've heard of before. Are we who we are currently today based on the things that we inherited from our parents, the DNA that they donated to create us? Or are we who we are today based on our experiences, the things that we've gone through? The nurture part of this question. So those are some of the main issues that we see discussed in developmental psychology. A couple of others are, do we change the slow, gradual process, continuity, or are our developmental stage-based, meaning that do we have more abrupt changes? So one day you go to bed, the next day you wake up, and you've developed in some major way, some new ability, some maturation that occurred overnight. So that would sort of indicate a stage approach. So we're looking at, do we continually grow and develop, or does it happen in stages? And then finally, we talk about, as a major issue in developmental psychology, are we the same individual we are today that we're going to be 5, 10 years from now? So are we stable as individuals, or do we change as individuals? And we'll see some of the characteristics that we possess, we're going to be very stable, and some we'll see thus change over time. So those sort of lay out the primary major issues that we talked about in developing across the lifespan. We started this chapter off as well looking at prenatal development and the competent newborn. What we mean by prenatal development is, what is the process that happens during conception? So conception will involve sperm and an egg, okay, donated by male and female members. And when they join, they form a zygote. This zygote is basically a fertilized egg. Okay, it enters a 2-week period of rapid cell division and develops into an embryo. At the same time, we see the placenta develops, which is sort of like a protective sac that aids in the transference of nutrients and oxygen to the embryo from the mother. Now, it should be noted that this sac does protect us, but it doesn't protect us from everything. In the textbook, we talk about tetragens, and these tetragens are substances that can cause damage to an unborn child. And one of the tetragens that was mentioned specifically in lecture and in your textbook is alcohol. The fetal alcohol syndrome is a result of a mother who continually drinks alcohol while they're pregnant, and it will have a developmental effect on the offspring. So the notion is that the system is designed to protect us, but it doesn't protect us from everything. And once we go through the embryo stage, we then get and develop into the fetus stage, where the developing human organism from 9 weeks after conception up until birth. So this is sort of like the basic process that we follow from conception all the way to birth. Now, we mentioned in the textbook and in lecture about the competent newborn. We call it a competent newborn because we're not born totally helpless. We are helpless to a large extent. We can't exist in the world without having someone take care of us as a human baby. But we do have certain skill sets, certain reflexes that we're born with. And these reflexes aid in our survival. We don't have to figure out how to eat. Okay, if a newborn had to figure out how to eat once they are born, if they had to learn it, we would see a higher mortality rate when it comes to newborns, because some of them would not be able to learn it. But the idea is, and this is what increases our survivability, is that we have these in us already, pre-programmed reflexes. So when the cheek is stimulated for a newborn, they will turn automatically and begin to suck. So they don't have to learn that process. The process is already within them. So we are helpless to an extent, but we do come in prepared to help aid in our own survival, which is a key idea that I want to make sure that we understand. So we have prenatal development, the competent newborn, and then we go and talk a little bit more about how it is that we develop cognitively, and that's with cognitive development. We talked about Piaget. Jean Piaget was an individual who was very interested in how people think, and he wanted to see how our development occurs when it comes to our thinking capability. He focused on cognition, and that includes things like thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. So that's all part of cognition. And he was interested in what that process was really like. He did not believe, and you shouldn't believe now, is that young people, they think differently than we do as adults. Okay, we just don't think the same way. So Piaget, he was a stage developmental psychologist, and so he said that we develop cognitively in stages. So the first stage he talked about was sensory motor stage. And the sensory motor stage, this is when we are from birth to around 2 years of age, and we spend a good part of that time crawling around, getting into the pots and pans in the kitchen, and we are learning. We are developing cognitively as we're performing those particular types of activities. Then he talked about the pre-operational stage, which is around from 2 to 6 or 7 years of age. And during that pre-operational stage, we can see things represented with words and images, but there are certain things that we're not able to perform yet. We don't understand conservation. We don't understand that simply the changing of something in shape of a container doesn't change the amount of the item that's being contained. So you have something that is squat and flat type of petri dish, and you pour milk from a big, huge jug into that large, flat petri dish. They may think there's less of the substance if you pour all the substance out. They just don't understand that the container may change, but the same amount of material is actually still there. Now, one interesting thing about pre-operational stage is egocentrism. The idea that at this time, early in this particular stage, kids do not understand that other people have their own points of view. This may make you understand why it is that your kid who's, let's say, 3 or 4 years old is standing in front of the television as you're watching some important game or some important sporting event, and they see the television fine. They don't understand why why you're screaming at them to move or to get out of the way, because as long as they can see it, they may believe that you can see it too, because they don't understand yet that you have a different perspective. So from those things, we see quite clearly that children, as they're learning to think, so to speak, they think differently than we do. They don't have the full understanding yet about how thinking actually works. So the next thing that we talk about is the concrete operational stage, where we are able to do mental operations and think logically about concrete events and form analogies. And then we have the formal operation stage, which is the last stage for Piaget, where we're able to do abstract thinking, where you're able now to have math classes where you can solve for X or solve for Y. Before I go into Vygotsky, are there any questions real quickly about what we covered so far? Okay. All right, so Piaget was just thinking about cognitively how we develop. Vygotsky, a Russian developmental psychologist, added a different perspective to it. Vygotsky believed that it's not just about what Piaget sort of outlined for us. He believed that we learn quite a bit from social interaction. Okay, and this social interaction is something that's very important because it provides a support structure for the young person as they develop higher levels of thinking. Just think of it this way. Those of you who have siblings, brothers and sisters, and these brothers and sisters, if they're older than you, they probably helped you learn things when you were growing up. Okay, and they may have helped you learn how to think at higher levels. So we see that this Vygotsky was just adding another component to cognitive development, a social component, which was a key idea at the time. So what Vygotsky and Piaget both did is they talked about how we sort of normally develop cognitively. The next topic is autism spectrum disorder, ASD. And this is not about normal development, because what we're talking about here is a sort of a different type of development that some people say can be somewhat problematic. Most people have had some awareness of what autism is. You may even know someone or someone who has a family member who has autism. It usually will appear around by age 8 or so. And the key factors that really point to autism is the lack of communication and social interaction skills. They just aren't able to connect. And it's thought to be primarily based on the way the brain is being wired, or the mind is wired, that they can't see other people's perspectives. It's going to be marked usually by fixated interests. They may like a certain thing and they like it to an extraordinary degree, and they may also perform a lot of repetitive behaviors. They like rigid schedules, and when the schedule is being disrupted, that can cause a great deal of distress for them. So we see with cognitive development, uh, autism is sort of like a variant of development, which is not a normal way in which we normally develop. Now, social development is another important aspect of our lifespan development and how we develop across the lifespan. First, we need to understand that even before we are born, okay, we are able to hear. So while we're still inside our mother, voices can be heard. So loud voices, talking, all this type of stuff. And what they've been able to demonstrate in research is that babies, especially newborns at birth, they have a preference for voices, and they have a preference for one voice in particular, and that is their mother. So we see at the very beginning, social development, there's preferences that the newborns may have when it comes to voices. Around 8 months or so, we see the idea of object permanence. Now, I didn't mention this previously today, but we did talk about it in lecture a little bit more previously. Object permanence is the idea that when some object in front of you is taken away, that it doesn't just disappear from reality, that it still has permanence. It's just not in front of you anymore. So we have that develop a little bit more around 8 months or so. But we also see this thing called stranger anxiety. By this time, the child has become very familiar with people who are in the household or people who visit rather frequently. But people who are not familiar to them, they will start to display some degree of anxiety at the presence of strangers, sort of shying away from them. Now, the other thing is separation anxiety. So this really bodes to the idea of attachment, and which we'll talk about in a second here. But when you become attached and you have familiarity with people, at around 13 months or so, we start to see the possibility of separation anxiety. That young infants at this time don't like to be separated from their primary caregiver or parent. I'm going to pause there and ask you guys, has anyone seen some indication of separation anxiety in a young infant? And I'm going to wait to see if anybody responds.
I have a
I have.
You have? Could
I
someone
have.
describe it to me real quickly? You don't have to go into great detail, but what happened when you saw this separation anxiety reveal itself?
Um, okay, so I know like when I taught like my 2-year-olds, they would like hate leaving their parents. They would throw a whole fit, be crying and stuff.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we see, and I've been told that I had a great deal of separation anxiety when I was younger, when I was being left with my grandmother. But the idea is that this is a normal thing that we do see, this separation anxiety. And normally what that communicates is that we do and have seen with the infant that they have attached themselves. They have formed an emotional tie with someone, usually a caregiver, a parent, a mother, or something of that nature. So that takes us to the next topic of attachment. And when it comes to attachment, these are emotional ties that we develop, and these also elicit desires to be close with the individual that we have the emotional tie with, and causes us to have some sort of anxiety when we become separated from them. Now, these attachments form in early life. I mean, one of the first things that we know to do these days when a mother gives birth to their child, once the first thing is, once they go and test the child and make sure everything's okay, they usually will put that newborn on the mother's chest to sort of help to start that process of creating that strong emotional bond, that strong emotional tie. Now, what we want to talk about next is this idea of attachment. And there was this study done by Harlow, two individuals named Harlow. They were a married couple, and they did some research with monkeys. And by now, you probably would have picked up on that in psychology, even though we're studying ourselves, human beings, quite a bit, there is a lot of stuff that we learn from research with animals. And these animals can help to illustrate things, give us ideas about how it is that we may operate as well. So Harry Harlow and Margaret Harlow, they raised monkeys with two artificial mothers. One was a bare wire cylinder with a wooden head with a feeding bottle, and the other one was just made of foam and cloth. And what they were able to illustrate was those animals, those monkeys, really wanted to be with the comfort cloth mother. So they would spend as much time they could holding on to that mother, that cloth mother, even at the expense of food. They'd get the food they needed, but there was a preference for contact. And that's one of the things, too, that we see when it comes to having formed an attachment. Those of you with children, you'll probably realize that you have that, too, where you are attached and the kid is attached and you want to hug them and kiss them and cuddle them and all that type of stuff. This is how we sort of reveal this attachment that is a very powerful thing in our life. Now, in addition to that, we need to understand that attachment is very, very powerful, and it has some longer term implications. Now, there was some attachment research done by Mary Ainsworth, and I think the study that she performed was called The Strange Situation. And basically, she would get a mother or a caregiver, I think it was usually the mother, and the child, and they would go to a strange place, a place that they weren't familiar with. So it was a new place for the kid. And basically, the kid and the mom would hang out for a bit, and then the mother would be taken away, would leave. And what they were interested in is to try to find out how the child would respond to the mother leaving. That was the key thing they were interested in. What did they do when the mother left? And also, what would they do when the mother returned? And so what she was basically able to uncover or to illustrate in this research study was two forms of attachment. And that's what she was trying to find out, the different forms of attachment. Secure attachment versus insecure attachment. And secure attachment, this scenario would be the likely scenario that you would see. The mom would get up and leave the room. The kid would make note that mom just got up, maybe show a little bit of anxiety that she's leaving, and then she would leave, and then the child would sort of calm down a little bit and get back to doing whatever they were doing. That would be a sign of secure attachment. Insecure attachment would be somewhat opposite, where the kid may pitch a fit when the mother leaves, well beyond just normal separation anxiety, and or the kid may be somewhat cold and distant to the mother when she returns. So insecure attachment can fall into two categories. Anxious, with the following characteristics: they want acceptance but fear of and looking for rejection. And avoidant, discomfort getting close and tends to self-sabotage. Well, that sounds a little bit highfalutin for young kids, obviously. But one of the key things about this is the following. Your attachment style that you develop when you're young may also have an impact on your later relationships. Does that make sense to you guys? I'll wait real quickly to see what your response is. You can either send it to chat or speak up.
Yes, sir, that makes sense.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
that
All
makes
right,
sense.
so you're mostly agreeing with that. The notion really is that we learn how to attach early in our life. And that has some holdover to later in our life. So you can imagine the following scenario. Someone who has developed secure attachment, let's say they're in a relationship now, they've developed secure attachment. And let's say I'm taking the male perspective here, and my girlfriend is, my new girlfriend is going to be driving out of town for a while. Drives out of town. I'll talk to her maybe in a day or two, or when she gets back, no problem. Secure attachment, I have no concerns, no issues. But insecure attachment will be indicated by the following. I call her about every other hour, okay? By contact her at night after I've already talked to her. What are you up to? What are you doing? Okay, so the notion there, that may be a sign of sort of a anxious attachment where I want acceptance, but I fear of and looking for signs of rejection. Or avoidant type, where you're really starting to get really close with somebody in a relationship, but then it's getting too heavy for you, getting too intense. And then you do something in order to stop that from happening, sort of a self-sabotage. So the research out there tend to suggest that we do see this type of behavior. So again, it's probably something that some of you have witnessed or seen before. So this attachment style sort of shows the idea of continuity that we referred to earlier in the in the continuity versus stages, or stability versus change, that at least attachment styles appear to be somewhat stable. The attachment style that we develop early in life may also have some impact on us later in life. So another thing that pops up during our lecture comes up with this notion of temperament. And temperament is your emotional reactivity and intensity. It's sort of related somewhat to the idea of attachment, and that's why I bring it up now. But a temperament is different, because what a temperament is something that you are born with. So you can see a certain temperament in a newborn. They could be only a couple of months old or so, and you can see, let's say you have twins, okay, and obviously the twins are the same age. One could have one temperament where they are very laid back and really chill babies, and the other one could be somewhat of a tense baby, that something drops in the kitchen, they hear it and they just start crying, whereas the other one doesn't cry. So that temperament is your emotional reactivity and intensity. And temperament, again, seems to be something that we're born with. And why we say that is that we see this behavior well before a baby could have learned anything. So we can learn our attachment style, okay, but we do not learn our temperament. And we can say someone was a difficult baby or an easy baby based on that temperament. So let's go back to this attachment style real quickly. Where does attachment style come from? We'll talk real soon about Erik Erikson. We'll just go over one of his psychosocial charts. But there is the first item, the first stage of social development per Erikson is something called basic trust. And basic trust is whether or not, as a young person, as an infant, do you develop a sense of trust in the world or a sense of mistrust in the world? And what they believe it's based on, your sense of trust or mistrust, is going to be based on your responsiveness or unresponsiveness of parents. So when a kid learns, when they cry, their parents are there on the spot to take care of whatever their needs are. Or the kid learns, if they cry and they need a caregiver, they don't come regularly. They only show up some of the time. That suggests that they may believe the world is mistrusting, that you should not trust it. So the idea is that during this basic trust stage and doing our caregivers' level of responsiveness, it may help to teach us one attachment style versus another. Hopefully that's clear. Let me know if it's not. All right. So that gives us some of the basic foundations of how we attach and how those styles are developed. Another one that some of you may know really well is going to be parenting. Now, I'm sure many of you may be parents out there, and everyone is a child, so they've had parents or at least somebody in their life that was a caregiver or guardian of some sort. And a large part of our development and our lifespan is going to be our parents or how we were parented as we were growing up. There are several basic forms of parenting styles. We have the authoritarian, which tends to be coercive. They're the ones who set the rules. This is the way you're going to be while you're in my house, while you're under my roof, type of thing. And they can be somewhat dictatorial as to how people are to behave, do as I say, not as I do, that type of thing. But the result of authoritarian styles of parenting, based on the research out there, is that the kids tend to have fewer social skills and tend to have lower self-esteem. Part of it could be because they've never really had the opportunity to test themselves out because they were always told what to do. Another style of parenting is the permissive, unrestraining type of parents. Basically, they let the kids do whatever they want to do. They stay out as long as they want. They can do whatever they can do, whatever they want can be done. This usually results in children who tend to be more aggressive and immature. Imagine, if you would, that someone who was raised in a permissive household and they show up whatever they want to show up for dinner or don't show up at all, that type of thing. Imagine that person getting a job for the first time and they get a job. Can you imagine something that could happen with someone who was raised with a permissive household? What type of problems could they get into if they had a job? Can anybody tell me something that could happen for someone who was very permitted to do anything they wanted to without any repercussions?
Well, they may reject, authority and disobey their manager.
That
Basically
is,
spoil.
yes, that's basically what we do see, is that they are immature. They don't understand that people in the quote real world, they have things that they're supposed to do. And if they don't do them the way they're supposed to or on the timing that they're supposed to, there are going to be consequences. So a lot of what parenting is, to a large degree, is preparing the child for the world. And an authoritarian parent doesn't allow the children to test their wings out because there's just too many rules and it's very coercive. The permissive parent doesn't give them any limits, but the world is filled with limits. And so that's also problematic. We also see the same thing when it comes to the negligent or the uninvolved parents. They're very similar to some extent of the permissive parent, but what we tend to see with the children who are the result of uninvolved parents is poor academic and social outcomes. The one that seems to be the most beneficial to children, the parenting style that seems to work the best, is the authoritative style of parenting. And it's referred to as confrontive. So they confront issues. And in this instance, what happens is there's still going to be rules, going to be guidelines and all this type of stuff, but they may go into negotiations, if you were, with the children to come up with the rules or the curfew or when they need to be home. So they're letting the child participate in the process of them being raised, in a sense. Now, the outcome for authoritative children who are raised in that manner tend to have the highest self-esteem and the highest social competence. So again, the research out there tends to say that most parenting styles, authoritative seems to be the most suited for getting high self-esteem and high levels of competence. So that gives us a lot of the social development that we covered during this week. The other one talks about physical development. First, there's the concept of adolescence. And adolescence is somewhat of a recent, last century or so concept where it's a protective bubble. And most people in this class, if they're still in their early 20s or so, could still be considered an adolescent. Adolescence, we'll go real quickly. The adolescence is from puberty to independence. That's sort of like the time of adolescence. But it is a protective bubble. it's a time where there's going to be fewer demands on an individual so that they have an opportunity to get their education, learn about themselves, learn who they are, and then become more independent. Now, part of this physical development starts off with puberty. Puberty is sexual maturation. And sexual maturation is basically you are going to be a child, but then when you become an adolescent, that's when you start puberty. That means that you are now capable of taking participation in the reproduction process, either fathering or carrying a child. Now, male and female timing when it comes to puberty is slightly different. And what I mean by that is that normally females will start puberty sooner than males will. So you could have them being children, and then at a certain age, the female will start to develop and become more adult-like, while their male counterpart is still somewhat underdeveloped. Now, the males will catch up a little bit later and then surpass the females and usually be a little bit taller than they are once puberty is over with. But before then, there's going to be a stage awkward for males where their female counterparts are usually going to be taller than they are and more developed sexually by way of their maturation. Now, so we see that happens, and there are going to be some differences there between males and females. But also, there's one key difference that all of them will share, and that's going to be the teenage brain. The teenage brain is much different than an adult brain. Most people probably listening to me now probably still have a teenage style brain because the frontal lobe development is still ongoing, usually into your 20s. It's still developing. And the frontal lobe, as you recall, is the place where we have planning, decision making. It's also the place where we have inhibition. So the frontal lobe stops us or inhibits us from performing certain types of actions. The notion is that we need to understand too, at the same time we have this teenage brain and we have lower inhibition, we also have a desire for higher risk taking. We have higher impulsiveness. We want to do things. Therefore, that leads to a really bad scenario is that for teenagers and people who are in their early 20s, they have this high desire for sensation seeking and risk taking and lower inhibition until their frontal lobe fully develops, which means they can do and find themselves in some situations that can be very problematic. And that is why, as we talked about in lecture previously, that there are laws on the books that does not hold teenage brains and people who possess those teenage style brains fully responsible at times for certain actions they may take. It's not to say they don't get punished, but they may not get punished as severely. So after physical development, we talked a little bit more about cognitive development as we're a little bit older. And one of the areas that we talked about was morality or moral thinking. And morality is about what is the right thing to do, what should we do, what's the right way to behave. And what it comes down to is that there was research done by Kohlberg, and he came up with what he referred to as moral thinking, 3 stages: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. In the pre-conventional stage, which is us until age 9 or so, we determine right or wrong based on what will get us punished or what will get us rewarded. Things that get us rewarded, that's right. Things that get us punished, that's wrong. So it's a very simplistic way to think about morality. Conventional morality is about rules and regulations. We do things so that we have order, so we avoid chaos. So these things that help us to avoid chaos, those things are right. We follow the rules because that's what should be there, so we have a more ordered society. And then we have post-conventional morality. This basically is about your own ethical principles that you have established. When you believe, for example, that the laws may be wrong, So you can break the law because your ethical principles are operating sort of at a higher standard. And so with moral thinking, we see those are the stages that people can go through. So the notion is that we see behavior can be controlled to some degree about how people are thinking morally about certain things. Is it only about if I get caught, it's wrong? That's pre-conventional thinking, okay? Or if I do it and it breaks the rules and regulations, destroys order, it's wrong. That's conventional. Post-conventional, excuse me, post-conventional would basically say you can start to protest things because you think there's something higher ethical principle involved here. All right. So that talks a lot about moral thinking from Kohlberg's perspective. Now, I want to spend a few seconds here, a few minutes here, just talking about Erik Erikson. I love Erik Erikson and his psychosocial stages of development. I think it's a wonderful thing that he developed here. So we've already talked primarily about the infancy stage, which is from birth to around a year or so, where the person develops a sense of trust or mistrust in the world. If needs are dependably met, the infants develop a sense of basic trust. Then we move on to toddlerhood, which is from 1 to 3 years old, which also include the 2 years terrible twos, where it's all about autonomy versus shame and doubt. They want to be able to exercise their will, to be able to say that they can do things for themselves so they don't doubt their abilities. Then we talked about the preschool from 3 to 6 years, initiative versus guilt. Preschoolers learn to initiate tasks and carry out plans, or they feel guilty about their efforts to be independent. The elementary school years, from 6 years to puberty, it's about competency versus inferiority. Children learn the pleasure of applying themselves to tasks or they feel inferior. So you can see each issue that they're talking about is about trying to develop certain types of skills to come out on the other side of the issue in a positive manner. And then we have adolescence, where many of you may be currently, and this is about identity versus role confusion. The key thing about this is that by the time you're in your adolescence, you may have gone through several versions of yourself. Sometimes you may have your hair dyed this way. You may have a mohawk, a bald head. You may do whatever. You may have piercings, tattoos. All of this is you trying out different senses of identity, different roles. And eventually, by the time you're getting out of adolescence, the notion is that you're going to integrate all the various versions of yourself that you've gone through into one complete identity, that you have now knowledge of who you are as an individual. If that is not the way it turns out, then you tend to have role confusion. You're not quite sure who you are. And obviously, one of the key things is this. If you don't know who you are, you may not be certain about what it is that you want. And that plays a very significant role in the next stage, young adulthood, which is usually around 20s to early 40s. The key issue there is intimacy versus isolation. Okay, young adults struggle to form close relationships and to gain the capacity for intimate love, or they feel socially isolated. So by knowing yourself, by having your identity sort of solidly established, you're more capable of understanding what it is that you want in a romantic partner. So intimacy is more likely to occur. If not, then isolation may be a result. So after that stage, we have middle adulthood from 40s to 60s, generativity versus stagnation. In middle age, people discover a sense of contributing to the world, usually either through family, by raising the proper type of children in a way, or through work, by doing something that seems to give back to society and to other people. If they don't have a way of generativity, of giving back, then they may feel that they have lacked purpose and feel somewhat stagnant. And then finally, the last stage that Erik Erikson came up with was the late adulthood, which is integrity versus despair. This is the late 60s on up. Here, this is where the person, the older person here, may reflect back on his or her life. If they can look back on their life and they can be pleased about what they were able to accomplish, the jobs that they were able to do and lives they were able to influence, or the children that they were able to raise that are now successful and contributing to the world and to their families, then they may have a sense of integrity. If they look back at their life and they cannot see those types of things, they may have a sense of failure, a lack of satisfaction. So this may explain why you may know some older people in your life, where some of them may be somewhat happy and pleased, some may be a little bit more cranky. It could simply be about how they see the results of their particular life. That may be part of the issue going on there. Are there any questions about Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages development? I know there was a lot there, but do I need to clarify anything that anyone has issue with or need clarification on?
You're good.
Okay, cool.
Oh, but
Yeah.
Mr. Professor Herbert, I'm about to leave soon. Is it fine I can leave now? Because I got a college class and I live 30 minutes from the
No problem. No problem. No problem. Okay.
All right.
All right. So here we go.
Well, see you, Mr. Herbert. Thank you.
See you. No problem. So the last few things that we want to cover before we wrap things up here are going to be focusing on the key ideas of social clocks. And we all have social clocks, and we know what the social clocks are. For example, if you are about ready to graduate from high school, what's next? Most students will say what's going to be next is going to be college. All right, so after college, it may be grad school. After grad school, they say, what's next? You may say, my career, my professional job. After your professional job, what's next? They'll say something, maybe marriage. After you've been married for a while, it's going to be family, children. So the idea is that we have these social clocks. Your parents and your grandparents know these social clocks too. That's why for a young couple that's married, the grandmother may ask the granddaughter, when are you going to provide me with a great grandkid or something of that nature? These are expected life events that occur. Expected life events. And we all sort of know where they fall. And sometimes when things prevent us from doing the social clocks, meeting these expected life events, we may receive pressure from other people because they too have these expected life events as well. Now, as we go through life, as we're developing across the lifespan here, and we're in middle age, for example, there may be events that occur during this midlife, triggering events during the midlife crisis, such as a divorce, an illness, or a job loss that may cause what we refer to as the midlife crisis, where you're starting to question yourself, starting to look back and say, I've lost my step. I'm not as capable as I used to be, which may result in people doing things like buying the sports car or other types of things as well. We even see what sometimes with the midlife crisis, people may start an affair, okay, because some other triggering event has caused them to question and go through sort of a crisis stage. So we see these social clocks and these triggering events, they are also part of our life as well. Now, a couple other things before I wrap up here that I want to cover is going to be the role of work. In our particular culture, and many Western cultures, but particularly in ours, work is extraordinarily important to us. It's how we identify ourselves. In fact, many of you who already have an idea of what you want your career to be, and you're in school in order to establish the degree, the background for that career, when you go out to a party and people ask, what is it that you do? You may talk about what career you're preparing for. That's the role of work for us. Has anybody known anybody who's worked for 30, 40 years of their life and then they went into retirement? I want to know what you think of real quickly about the impact of retirement on some people. I want to see if you have some views on that. I'll wait for a brief minute here. Anyone know anyone who's retired? Are they handling retirement okay?
No.
No? Okay. Well, that's good. That's what I wanted to hear in a way, is that oftentimes when people have worked a lot during their life and now they have been forced to retire at some time, but they've reached retirement age, they've retired, the issue is going to be this. Some people will not be able to stand it. Because think about this. Let's say you've worked 30, 40 years in an occupation. You had influence over people's lives. You had people that reported to you. And now all of a sudden, this significant way to how you identified yourself. In fact, when you were in the middle of working as part of your career and you went to a party, you would say, they ask you at this party, what is it that you do? And you say, I'm a bank manager. I've been a bank manager for 20 plus years. I'm a bank manager at such and such a bank. I do this, I do that, and all that type of stuff. But now all of a sudden, this retired individual who's been retired for a couple of years now, he's at a party. What does he say? He can't say necessarily that he is this. He'll have to say, I was that. And so a lot of people find it very difficult to deal with retirement because they've lost a great sense of identity. Their self-identity was so wrapped up in their occupation. So the last thing that we cover here deals with aging well. How is it that we age well? And we will all age, and there's going to be decrements in one's mental capability and physical capability. Many of you are relatively young, so you haven't really experienced most of this yet, but aging is a normal process, and you know what it sort of is going to be like, so we don't have to go into great detail about it. But people can age well, and we talk about successful aging here. So some people will have biological influences on aging well. They have a genetic predisposition to early cognitive, or they don't have it to some issue with early cognitive design or physical decline, meaning you have good genes, okay? And you have a proper nutrition, and you also have, for example, a good physical regime, that you exercise quite a bit. That will fall under the psychological influences and the optimistic outlook. And optimism is a great thing. Seeing the world as a glass half full as opposed to half empty has a great deal of impact on you, physically and mentally. We see that's a very powerful thing. Having social connections, social cultural influences, support from family and friends, cultural respect for aging, and safe living conditions all play a great deal. So it's great when you see that said that when people do retire and they have all that free time, it's a powerful thing to be able to enjoy it. And, you know, with the proper balance, people can do that. But the notion is that many of us who face retirement, it's going to be a difficult thing to do. Some people will be fine with retirement, as I see someone's writing here, that when you have done all the things that you need to do and you've lived a great life and a good career life, and you have other things that you can do, other things that take up your time. And that could be part of the problem with some people who retire, that their whole life to a large degree has been about work, not about other things that they can do. So that now that you enjoy other things outside of work, if you have retirement, you have a great deal of time to do those other things that you love quite a bit. So I'm going to take a few minutes here to see if there are any questions or comments, and then I'll do a quick round to see, make sure I got everyone who's here today. Any questions or comments so far about what we covered? Okay, cool. All right, so basically what we've done today is we've gone over some of the key ideas and concepts for Chapter 4, Developing Across the Lifespan. Next week, we'll begin the Chapter 5, which is going to be Sexuality and Gender. So we'll be talking about that, and I'll be preparing a lecture for that as well. So in preparation for next week's check-in, if you haven't, please try to see the video lecture before and see if you have any questions or comments about the lecture points covered in that particular Chapter 5. And then save them up or email me, but save them up and we can talk about them during the check-in. All right, really last call. Are there any questions or comments before we get out of here? Okay, so I want to thank all of you guys for being here today. Let me do a real quick check to make sure I have all the people's names here. A couple more I need to write down here. So we have Devin, Laura, okay. I think that's it. Okay, if there are no other questions or comments, you guys are free to get out of here. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good
Take care.
day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Huh? Psychology.